Thank you, Beth. We'll have some time now for questions to all of the panel. And following the tradition we started yesterday, please introduce yourself before asking your question.
My name's Esko. I work for the Satori Lab. We're culture hackers working with government. My question's for Beth, really. I'm pretty optimistic that we're going to figure out. Is this thing working? No.
Okay.
Hello.
There you are.
Hi. I'm Esko. I'm from the Satori Lab. We're culture hackers that work with government. My question's for Beth. I'm pretty optimistic that we're going to find wiser tools for accessing the kind of novel ideas from the crowd. But then the next problem is that in our experience, when you do manage to kind of bring ideas from the outside into the government, is that government reacts like an immune system, right? And kills them off pretty quickly. And whether that's kind of the political class or public officials, it's inherently a threatening idea. So I wonder if you've got any comments on, once we've figured out how to effectively harvest and harness ideas from the crowd, how do we make sure that they actually bed in and become realities within the government system?
You're absolutely right, and we have, as I mentioned before, we have, at least on the federal level, we have a legal prohibition against harnessing the ideas of the crowd. The Federal Advisory Committee Act, which was enacted in 1972 with the best intentions to promote transparency in how government gets advice, actually functions to make it impossible to convene a group. Today, my colleagues from GovLab are organizing a meeting in Washington. Why? Because the Department of Commerce can't convene the companies who are using open data lest they violate this statute. So they call us up and we convene the meeting for them. That's how the workaround often works, and many people in academia are familiar with this, have had to do this before. I mean, willingly, not had to do this, willing to do this before. So the point of what I think are of demonstration projects is vital that have evidence back of them. So if this FDA project is successful, and we have some evidence to show that it works, I think that creates the momentum for a legal change, but also for a culture shift. There have been other experiments like it before. It's not the first of its kind, but they've never been studied as they've been rolled out, and so there's no story to tell afterwards to support a change. So you're absolutely right, but that allergy has been there a long time.
Yeah, and I'm actually pretty pessimistic about existing organizations adapting. Just having done this so many times and doing all this field work, there's a great book chapter by Elting. It's called Gunfire at Sea, which talks about how variable control gunfire was invented and then diffused in the US Navy. And for a good 15 years, even in the face of irrefutable statistical evidence that variable aim gunfire was better than fixed gunfire, the US Navy resisted until Roosevelt, by presidential fiat, made the person who was advocating head of ordnance for the US Navy and made that change happen.
That's what we need.
So the problem is that these institutions are so different and so new, and even in the face of really good performing things, people in the incumbent organizations are very threatened, and that's why I've been sort of talking a lot about partnerships, because I think if you make it less threatening, if you include them in the process, you make it that's going to amplify their ability and instead of take away their ability, it should be helpful. But if it's done in isolation and then you parachute in the solution, good luck.
Hi, Joanna Bryson, University of Bath. This is mostly to Kareem. It touches on Beth, but I think she's got a better solution. It has to do with income disparity, basically. When you drew those graphs about those fat tails that are incredibly bright that come up with good solutions, that's nice. But there's that large bulk of people that put a lot of time in that had below average answers that weren't useful. And when you mentioned Sebastian Thrun as one of these outlier third world people, he had millions of dollars behind him from Stanford to participate in DARPA. Personally, I'm from a relatively small university, up and coming, research led, blah, blah, blah. But I spent 2 years of my life trying to get a 3-year American military grant, and I only got a 1-year contract for a 3-year grant. And my university wasn't able to sustain the situation we had, when that ended. And I'm an academic. When you're going to poor people from the third world, what are you doing when you source their labor?
So I think that's a great question. I think that's why I don't study political science and economic disparity. I study innovation in a glib way. But I think what we know. So participating in a contest is actually pretty irrational, right? If you sort of think about it, because if you know the distribution of skills and you know that it's going to be winner take all, or the top 2 or top 3, why would we see all this entry? And we keep seeing repeatedly sort of over entry in contests that we run. And the reason is that people learn. People improve their skills and so forth, at least from the settings I study, right? So we've surveyed these people, we've understand, and what they come back with is saying, I'm learning, I can create signals. So even if I was not in the top 10 for the NASA challenge, right? Yeah. I'm 11, 12, 13. My solution still beats the internal solution, so I can use that as a signal in the outside labor market. That's no panacea, again, for the types of questions you're raising. But the reality is that most of our world is going to become this transparent. Our skills are going to be measured. And then we have, as societies, have to figure out how do we support the broader distribution.
Yeah,
right?
no, exactly. I think that's why I preceded it by income disparity. There are a lot of people now looking like the UK is trying to refactor. They don't have that much money to invest into research. They have some, and we could invest in that instead of some other things, but whatever. And they're saying, let's do these competitions. And that favors the really large universities that can take that risk, that can afford that risk. So I think it's a serious issue. And I have less issue with okay, in your spare time you build up some expertise and then someone comes and actually pays you for that. So that's why I was saying I was happier with the model that Beth was presenting than the model you were presenting.
Thank you.
Great talks, thank you. Hiroki Sayama from SUNY Binghamton and Northeastern. I think the competition mechanism works nicely if you have clear evaluation criteria. And it fails when no one actually knows how to evaluate it.
Yeah, think about academic science, right?
Yeah, like allocation funding. And also the search and the matching of the expertise also requires you to know what kind of expertise is required to solve the problem. So my question is how to make the either competition or expertise matching, that kind of mechanism to be scalable so that we can actually apply those techniques to solve the more complicated or complex real-world problems.
Is that to me?
Yes.
Oh, gosh. Of course, I take exception that the problems we're solving aren't real-world problems. Like the space station problem is extraterrestrial, but still, still a pretty big, important problem. Yeah. I think what we do have, and I don't have an answer for you. What we do have is a tension between self-selection and matching, right? In some of the work I've done, we've shown that the problem solvers tend to not be experts in the problem domain, but come from outside the domain. So how can we design a problem? And I think Natalia is in the audience. Natalia Lavina from NYU is here. She's done some pretty deep ethnographic studies thinking about how we design problems, right? And ways in which we can create the right abstractions so we can rely on diverse knowledge sets to come through. Again, I take a shortcut because I pick computational problems that can be abstracted out, can be made into a math problem, and devoid of the context. And that gives me the variation in performance I need for the peer reviewers that are in the audience who blow up when there's no good performance metrics. So I sort of do that, but I think it's an ultimate challenge to sort of say, we want self-selection because we know self-selection, and work by Scott Page at Michigan is very informative here because he basically says that when you have diversity in the crowd, you can basically have different perspectives and heuristics on both the solution, but I also think what's going on is how they're defining the problem as well, which makes this happen. But matching is a tough thing. Matching is economists have basically done organ matching and so easier, or medical student to medical school matching, but expertise matching is a tough thing. So
we need expertise for expertise matching.
Yeah.
And I agree with you strongly, and I didn't mean to suggest that you can't substitute. The self-selection part is so important to the success of these projects. So this is less about necessarily perfect matching than just even trying to create a pool or trying to essentially create awareness. It doesn't substitute for creating the incentives for people to participate and to self-select, I don't think. And I think we have so little understanding of how to map at this point, we have so little understanding of how to map these decision-making processes at different stages in a governance domain to these kinds of techniques, where they might work. Problem identification versus problem solving versus implementation are very, very different kinds of work. But we're getting started.
Yeah, but also I just want to remind the audience that, yes, there's a knock that we can only apply contests to settings where the evaluation criteria is transparent and you can create objective criteria. But $30 billion of NIH funding per year is based on fuzzy criteria.
Yeah.
Right? All of NSF NIH funding is based on somebody writing a proposal and then somebody making a judgment saying this is going to work or not. So we as academics participate in this same kind of a contest every year. Third to half of our time is spent in participating contests where 10% of us get funding, the rest don't, based on criteria that's ultimately very fuzzy.
But frustrating.
I'm Van Paranak from SOAR Technology, and my questions focus on Henry Farrell's presentation. I was fascinated by the model. I've done some work with Cosmo before. That'll be an exciting collaboration. It's a commonplace that all models are wrong, but some models are useful. And I think I'm very interested in seeing you work on a useful model. Usefulness in this case, I think, is a model that's able to replicate some of the dissension that we see in the political process and give us insight into why it's happening. And with that in mind, it seems to me that two features of your model maybe will, in fact, not allow you to see the dissension that we're interested in, and I'd be interested in your comments on them. One is your assertion that each actor's actions are one-dimensional. It seems to me that a lot of the difficulties that we face in the political process are that actions are never one-dimensional. And while they may have an intended outcome, they accomplish something else as well. And one of the big differences among political factions, I think, is that they're attending to these multidimensional effects and prioritizing them differently. The second is your attempt to capture the power structure that we recognize as present in politics with an elite that has access to more of the predictor variables than the non-elites do. Now, we recognize that there are elites, but some of us question very much whether that eliteness is correlated with an increase in their actual competence, which is exactly what your model pretends. Could you comment on, number one, would you care to defend these selections if in fact you agree that these limit the emergence of controversy in your model? Where do you expect to generate the realistic picture of controversy that we experience?
Okay, those are really great questions. The answer to the first is you're absolutely right. And this is simply for convenience. We hope in later work to have the actual action taken also be high dimensional, with the idea that this will then allow us to get precisely at these aspects of negotiation and compromise in a more sophisticated and more useful way. And the reason for the adoption of the assumption that elites are in some sense smarter than non-elites, it's partly, it goes back to, there's a long tradition of work that tries to do this, of sort of the Scott Page work, which Karim just mentioned, is a good example of this. So we're trying to talk to that literature, but we're also trying to figure out, it's in some senses almost rhetorical as much as anything else. That is, that if we give elites an edge in this process, and if we introduce all of these complexities which Scott doesn't really address in his work, and if we can still show that non-elites are able very often to come up with better decisions, and that the variance in the power of elites seems to have negative consequences for the decision making that is taken, even when you load the dice to some extent in favor of elites, then it becomes a more powerful set of results if in fact ordinary people who have a more diverse pool of cognitive resources to draw upon end up still being better decision makers. So in a certain sense, what we're doing here is we're loading the dice and hoping, and again, as I say, this is highly preliminary. We are at the very beginning of this process, but if we find that even when the dice are loaded against the non-elites, they still produce better stuff, this has some pretty interesting political implications, and I dare to say some radical political implications about the ways in which American democracy functions.
So you're doubling down in the hopes of an a fortiori argument at the end.
Exactly.
Yeah. Thank you.
Jock McClellan, Wiser World Web. Henry, you seem to gloss over the possibilities for deliberative democracy. I'm involved with Everyday Democracy, which helps communities put together small groups to define problems over a period of weeks, come up with some resolutions in a facilitated environment of equal power. If Hélène Landemour were here, I think she'd probably be talking about crowdsourcing in Finland to adopt legislation, or crowdsourcing in Iceland to develop a constitution. So I wonder if you and Beth could both comment on the upsides and downsides of deliberative democracy.
Small topic. I'll just two things briefly in the interest of time. First, a plug. We are organizing an online conference. We've already done one. We're doing two of them because of time zones on Monday. We're doing an event on crowd law, which is bringing together people who have worked on the drafting of constitutions or legislation online from places like Finland and Iceland and elsewhere. We have people from 20 different countries participating across two sessions to compare exactly those experiences, how drafting, what works and what doesn't work. So a plug for that you can find the details on thegovlab.org. But the challenge, I think one of the ways that I got into this, I'm a sort of student of and kind of schooled in deliberative democratic theory. And one of the challenges for me has always been the disconnect between institutions and deliberation. So not talking about deliberation in Congress, or the lack thereof, to Henry's point, but talking about how we connect up the kind of work that is done and that we've learned so successfully at the kind of small group citizen level with institutions and the power of the purse that they hold and the decision-making power that they hold. So it's really at the intersection between the two, and I think there are a lot of new platforms emerging. I've just been looking at Lumio this week, which is a new open source platform it's built on kind of principles of deliberative democracy. The folks out in Dayton, the foundation in Dayton, excuse me, Anybody? Are about to show a new platform next week, a deliberative democratic platform that's meant to take deliberation into the crowdsourcing era to some extent, but I think we've had a lot of problems with A, figuring out how to scale it, and B, connected up to the way that institutions actually work. Matt's work in this space has, I think, been really instrumental in showing the way that you can create deliberation in a community and enable communities to make choices in ways that can scale. So I think that there's interesting work at this. But the challenge has always been that the world of deliberative democracy, I feel, has been too content to be divorced from the world of institutions and power.
I guess the very short version of my answer would be horses for courses, which is to say that there are some contexts in which deliberation works extremely well, and here it is very, very valuable. But if you're looking at large, complicated, rumbustious societies where people have stark disagreements of interest, stark disagreements of political philosophies, it's very, very hard to see how deliberation can work at scale. And if you look for the original work on deliberation, Jürgen Habermas and others, you see that they are talking about this in a certain sense as a thought experiment. What would the world be like if we were able to leave these interests at the door, and how these arrangements might work? So I think that where we can have semi-deliberative institutions, and when they work extremely well. This tends to be at a relatively low scale of aggregation, as Bess has just said. It's very hard to get this stuff to scale up because of difficulties of communication. It's also very hard to get it to scale across genuine, strong differences of belief and opinion. Where you can do it, great, but there are huge swathes of political activity where it probably isn't going to work very well, and we need to think about how to organize those.
Hello, I'm Eddie Lee from Wisconsin. So I had a question for Henry. So I was curious about how your model compares with data on decision-making in different contexts. Also related to this, with decision-making, it does turn out to be the case, right, that very simple models can capture, complex aspects of decision-making. So I was wondering about those sort of two aspects.
Well, as the previous questioner indicated, our model is still very, very limited in its ability to capture key aspects of decision making. This is a beginning of a research agenda rather than the culmination of one. And really what we're trying to capture here are not the complexities of debate and argument as such, where there's a huge variety of interesting work that could be built on. Here in particular, I think that there's a very valuable research agenda to be pursued by pursuing some of the insights of Hugo Mercier and Dan Sperber. Have a wonderful article talking about how the individual cognitive vices of confirmation bias and so on can be turned in a sense into collective virtues under the right context of group decision making. Here, I think this is a separate and complementary agenda, which I'm very, very interested in and which COSMA is interested in too, but which probably is going to be difficult or impossible to incorporate in the kind of modeling that we're talking about. So like all of these, as you say, it's very, very simple. It's relatively extremely crude. It generates useful insights, but by no means should this be the only research agenda that people are pursuing in order to model these kinds of processes.
Right. I guess in terms of simple, I was wondering in terms of, right, and I mean, there are things you can do where you sort of try to model the individual and sort of how his thinking may influence the outcome. There are other more coarse-grained approaches where you might just look at the output of the system and from that try to infer what's going on inside without really trying to go into the more details of individual cognition. I was wondering, right?
Yeah.
Whether, I mean, it seems like you're sort of doing the former approach, how that sort of meshes with how you're thinking about it or whether I'm interpreting everything.
I think that's right. I think that's right. And clearly matching our kinds of arguments to the world, the plethora of data that is being created out there is going to be an important challenge in and of itself.
Thank you. One final question.
Vivek Goyal, Boston University. Well, let's see if I can ask two questions as one. But I had a kind of a narrower question probably for Kareem, and then also a broader question that I was hoping more of you would comment on. The narrower question is whether through models or experimentation you understand whether winner-take-all rewards actually extract the best work out of a crowd. And then the broader question is whether extracting work from crowds through contests, whether this is kind of encouraging a winner-take-all economy, and whether that's actually a longer-term concern as we see more and more crowdsourcing.
That's a great question. So, my own trajectory in this research stream was I first, really got enamored and wanted to study open source software communities, which don't have a contest structure in terms of the outcomes per se. And it was lots of community sharing, lots of knowledge sharing, lots of openness. And so when I stumbled into contests as an alternative way to organize the outside world for innovation, I was very resistant initially. I was just like, there's no way, there's no way this will work. But the data spoke, and it works really well. And I think the question is really, you have to step back and sort of think about sorting and selection in the economy, right? You see, some of our research that we've done in trying to sort of think about how people sort into a contest regime or a community regime is basically indicating that people have strong preferences. Some people prefer to work in settings where there are these winner-take-all contingent pay types of settings, variable pay types of settings, and other people prefer the more flat or even just the community structure that exists. And so it's not so much that which institution is better. I think it's the match between the institution and the person. And we do, at least in the data we have, we do see some correlation between skill and preferences to work on your own and to actually prefer a contest regime. But I mean, I think that's also depending on the context that we've studied this in and so forth. That's probably biasing our data. So I think my answer to your question is that in the economy we have different institutions that attract different sorts of people, right? So it's a selection effect, not a treatment effect. And I think once we start accommodating that, then what we want are diversity of institutions that can accommodate different types of preferences. And then there's a separate question about the knowledge you have and your ability to get the job done in the institution itself. We see, even within a contest-like setting, that the self-selection effect is as strong as the incentive effect, and skills don't account for more than 10% of the variance. And so anyway, we're sort of seeing these things, and I think my answer back is both institutions exist. They attract different types of people, and we want our society to have different types of institutions running.
Okay, let's thank the speakers again.